1974, the Wolverine first appeared in The Incredible Hulk issue number 180. This first illustration was drawn by Herb Trimpe. He was created by Marvel Editor-in-Chief Roy Thomas, writer Len Wein, and designed by Marvel Art Director John Romita Sr. At the time, he was a Canadian government operative, called upon to put a halt to the devastation caused by a battle between the Incredible Hulk and the Wendigo. The Hulk is considered amongst the strongest and most durable characters in all of comics. In addition to possessing a tough hide, he has rapid healing, which is typically depicted to increase with his rage. The Wendigo is based on the Native American mythological creature or evil spirit. The Wendigo is essentially a curse that is cast upon one who commits the act of cannibalism in certain parts of the Canadian wilderness. The accursed is reduced to a mindless beast that is virtually unkillable, but the creature can be knocked out or incapacitated, as Wolverine was able to do successfully in the issue due to the lethal nature of his adamantium claws, though he would later fall from a single glancing blow from the Hulk. In the What If series, the Watcher would reveal that in an alternate timeline, Wolverine could have been the victor, killing the Hulk. Hello again, dear Internet. Some guy here. Join me as I discuss a fictional character who is considerably my most favorite, and expound on some of his appearances which for me are his most significant in pop culture. There has been a myriad of comic titles featuring a myriad of comic characters that have interested me over the years. I often find myself ruminating on which character I identify with the most. Perhaps you have pondered this question yourself. For me, it is a question that considers both the super abilities and the psyche of the individual. At least three main archetypes come to mind. The first, which is exemplified by Thanos of Titan. Thanos is an alien native to the moon of Saturn known as Titan. He is part of an evolutionary offshoot of humanity known as the Eternals. His appearance is the result of an expression of a recessive mutant gene known as the Deviant. He is a being of immense power, manifested by a scope of multiple abilities which has only grown in magnitude. He represents a kind of high-tier super being on a cosmic scale. Though his recent portrayal in the Marvel Cinematic Universe was superb, his cinematic version is of the lawful evil alignment, while his comic book version is more chaotic evil. Like so many villains and anti-heroes, the most accurate portrayal relative to the comics would perhaps be too dark for the producers to find suitable for a successful box office draw, as it would undoubtedly require an R rating. With the recent success of Deadpool, perhaps this will change. But it is the true dark nature of Thanos which is for me one of his most alluring qualities, along with the range of his strength and powers. The second archetype is personified in Batman, one of the earliest examples of a hero I was exposed to, second only to Superman. As time went by, Batman would intrigue me exceedingly. He is, for all intents and purposes, a man, void of any superpowers. But he represents the zenith of what a man can achieve if he dedicated himself to be the absolute best version of himself he can be. However, Batman, even on his best day, cannot go toe-to-toe physically with the likes of Doomsday. But Batman wouldn't. He'd somehow find an indirect way to defeat him. Somewhat like Reed Richards did when he used the ultimate nullifier to circumvent the will of Galactus, a being far more powerful than any on Earth. But this street-level archetype still has appealed to me despite the lack of significant powers. It is characterized by peak human athletic ability and intellect, with an emphasis on hand-to-hand fighting proficiency acquired through years of training, often with the use of weapons, technology, and even chemicals. something which in theory can be achieved by anyone. It serves as a personal inspiration for me in terms of fitness. In many ways, he is the polar opposite of Thanos. This duality of the lawful good and lawful evil alignment and its inherent trappings represents a dichotomy in mine and I suspect many people's psyche, which becomes most apparent when determining how to play a role-playing game in which choices representing each extreme have consequences in the playstyle and in the story.
I need water. I'm dying. No!
There is a third archetype that I find appealing. For me, it serves as a medium between the two alignments. In an arena with some heavy hitters, albeit at a disadvantage, he can have a place. And yet the matchup can be made with guys like Batman, and occasionally as a wild card for the likes of Thanos. It is the Berserker, associated with frenzied melee attacks, sharp piercing weapons, and the ability to absorb some major damage with reckless abandon. A subclass of the tank.
No, that can't be it.
It's toned for me as one of the main appeals of the aptly named Berserker anime series.
I should only be thinking about wielding my sword and how I'll kill them.
It is why Vegeta is my favorite character in Dragon Ball Z. My desire to play in this style is embodied by Wei Yan in the Dynasty Warriors series. It compels me to play as Ken as opposed to Ryu in Street Fighter. Ken's moves seem more guided by raw emotions and rage. If I were to be in a Star Wars game, I'd in all likelihood be a Sith Lord. I roll the Enhancement Shaman talent tree in World of Warcraft Classic. And when I play a boxing game, I normally play in a manner styled around Mike Tyson. Probably the earliest example of this Berserker archetype was introduced to me in the form of Wolverine. Once upon a time, during a seminal period of my life known as the 80s, comics were pretty ubiquitous, and I don't mean in the cinema. No, the only superhero movies of note of the decade being Superman 2 with the late Christopher Reeve, and Batman with my favorite Batman, Michael Keaton, and probably my favorite Joker, Jack Nicholson.
Son of a bitch, come to me.
Then comic book inspired media did exist, but even back then I felt they lacked a certain seriousness, as though the very makers weren't taking it too seriously, almost beneath them. Or perhaps they just lacked the budget. No, comics were everywhere in the form of the actual comics. In the grocery stores, corner stores, everywhere usually had a comic rack or whole aisle dedicated to comics and magazines, with titles from DC, Marvel, Dark Horse, Malibu, Valiant, and Harris Comics amongst others, with magazine publications dedicated to comics. Comics back then weren't as popular as they are now. They weren't cool per se, but they weren't exactly uncool either. Those of us who were seen in public with them were labeled as geeks. Thanos wasn't a household name, nor Wolverine to be sure. The mainstream superheroes were the big three: Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man, and a distant third. From what I can recall, there was, and perhaps still is, a contingency of hardcore comics geeks that actually do not like Wolverine. He is kind of the antithesis of a hero. He comes off as this hairy manlet with metallic claws, who is often depicted on the homely side. He regularly gets his ass handed to him, and rarely got the girl. This was a time when wrestling was popular as well, and so in that context, Wolverine was definitely more of a heel and not the face. This was well before Stone Cold Steve Austin hit the wrestling scene, and the heel transcended the boos they would normally garner and transitioned into cheering for the bad guy you love to hate. And this was part of Wolverine's charm. In the vast sea of comics, he stood out. In an era with some of the greatest and most sensational artwork the medium has ever produced, he had an underdogish appeal. His costume had a Batman-like quality to it, but I knew he was no Batman. And those claws weren't just for show. He used them with lethal effectiveness. The anti-hero and berserker archetype go hand in hand. The chaotic good alignment. Perhaps I'm not in the mood to play lawful good, but what if I wanted to walk that fine line and be willing to cross it? With good intentions, of course. And at that time, Wolverine felt like my own favorite. Not the household name he is now, but something altogether more personal. Perhaps I was delusional. For a time, I would readily consume any media in which he was featured. As is the case today, back then as well, the action figures were a way of having a tangible form of some of your favorite fictional characters. I too would possess many such toys, with notable examples being the Michael Knight from the popular Knight Rider series, Slapdash of Transformers fame, RoboCop from the popular movie, Daredevil of Marvel Comics, which would include 2 Wolverine action figures, one of which is the sole remnant of my childhood toys, which has endured to this day. What would become the internet wasn't available to me at that time, along with most of the general public. And in order to learn more about your favorite comic character, you usually had to go to the source. In the case of Wolverine, much of his backstory was shrouded in mystery to comic book readers for many years. His real name was known only as Logan. Bits and pieces of his backstory would be revealed over the years, including a false narrative regarding his paternity. His own memory of his past has been altered by his own healing factor, which erases traumatic events from his past. For me, at least, there was only one medium outside of comics which I was exposed to Wolverine, in the form of the equally ubiquitous arcades and the self-titled X-Men arcade game. A rare sight for me in those days, as it was capable of accommodating up to 5 players. I never actually played it, as it was usually in use by other people and queued up, but it looked and sounded amazing for its time. It was inspired by the 1989 pilot to the failed X-Men animated series, in which Wolverine's voice had an Australian accent. There were several X-Men console games available, but the one which I would be first introduced to was the X-Men video game for the Sega Genesis, replete with a most intense cover, with Wolverine displayed prominently, a common motif when he is featured. Wolverine's character was unique in that he had a healing factor. If you were low on health, you could just go to a quiet corner and wait, while his health would rejuvenate. This feature could be used to share power between other players as well. This game was a little frustrating because you could only use your mutant powers based on how much you had on a gauge. If you tried to use Wolverine's claws when you depleted your mutant power gauge, he would erupt into a berserker fury at the cost of health. Unless you knew how to play with Nightcrawler, it was one of the most frustratingly difficult games to beat. Modern gamers are spoiled. Back then, there were no save games, and you had a finite number of continues, as the games were usually modeled after the arcades, which were designed around getting players to spend more quarters. If you were about to defeat Magneto on Asteroid M, and the power cut off during a thunderstorm, you were just shit out of luck. This aspect of gaming is all but lost on modern games, in which the ability to save is standard. In those days when you made it to a level you kept dying on, you sometimes had to pause the game to collect yourself to make the attempt, especially if you knew you only had one continue left. Oftentimes, the nerves would simply prove too much. This was especially true on the particularly difficult Mojo World level. After you figure out how to finally defeat Mojo, the game would continue inexplicably. I remember being so pleased with myself after finally defeating Mojo, only to find this glitch or puzzle waiting for me. After trying many things to no avail, I frustratingly turned it off. If only I had pushed the reset button, I'd have proceeded to the next level. The sequel, X-Men 2 Clone Wars, was at the time the most satisfying game adaptation of Wolverine and the X-Men in general. There was no mutant power gauge. Wolverine's claws could be used to climb places unreachable to most other players, and he could dispatch enemies with one swipe of his claws. I must point out that the later levels on this game are ridiculously difficult to beat, even with cheat codes. I still own a working Sega Genesis 3 with both titles, and will occasionally bust it out and play many retro games inspired by comics in a fit of nostalgia. The growing success and popularity of comic-inspired media like video games coincided with television when, in 1990, Fox Kids started a new programming block which would feature Batman the Animated Series, and the X-Men was teased. Admittedly, I wasn't too keen on the Batman Animated Series at first, as I found that the animation did not reflect the surreal artwork from the comics, and the early episodes did not exemplify the kind of storytelling I desired. Due to the nature of Batman, the stories were less super and more about ground-level detective work and street-level crime fighting. As I explained in a previous video, American action cartoons up until then had left much to be desired. Although the original Batman animated series was an upgrade, the most noteworthy action cartoons for me up until then were the Pirates of Dark Water, Transformers, and the Thundercats. Though Thundercats was animated in Japan, it is generally not considered anime due to its being produced, written, and voiced in the United States. Though anime proper did exist at the time, I would not have a proper introduction until I was blindsided by Sailor Moon. But more on that in another video. While I did not fully appreciate the Batman animated series at first, as the inception of what would become the DC animated universe, its totality, in my opinion, is the greatest American animated action series of all time, eclipsing even the X-Men. However, at the time, the X-Men animated series on Fox was the most badass American cartoon at the time. It was the first of its kind to produce action of an edge I found satisfactory, with an animation of a style closely resembling the source material. People got shot, albeit with energy guns. The villains were very intimidating. It would be the first action animated cartoon which hinted at, if not outright depicted, mortal situations. Despite the lethal nature of Wolverine's claws, the writers found badass ways for him to use them, without being too edgy. I believe many young men tend to look up to other males, both real and fictional. And for a time, the Wolverine from the animated series was one of mine. Perhaps I internalized his persona and voice and demeanor. Some of the artwork fueled my already robust affinity for bodybuilding and artwork in general. Regrettably, it didn't go to the point of pursuing martial arts past a yellow belt, and thankfully I never took up smoking.
Berserker Barrage!
It would be the first time that I'd hear some of the most iconic words of my favorite character.
Tornado Claw! Drill Claw!
Voiced by Carl Dodd.
Let's go, bub.
For me, this portrayal is the standard to which I would judge subsequent adaptations of the character.
Rookie.
In a brilliant move, it would be he who would also voice Wolverine in the video game X-Men Children of the Atom fighting game, Marvel superheroes, and the classic X-Men vs. Street Fighter franchises. The internet modding community would find a way to port characters from these titles and various other games, and even create some originals of their own in the open source Mugen game, complete with many forms of different characters in pop fiction, including Wolverine. It was also in the vaunted animated series which I had a proper introduction to arguably his most notable adversary, Sabretooth, the Joker to his Batman. A most mortal and dangerous adversary. He is in fact bigger and stronger than Wolverine. He also possesses a healing factor and keen animal senses of Wolverine as well. In Wolverine issue number 127, Wolverine stated himself that Sabretooth's healing is superior to his own. While Wolverine does possess superhuman strength, I do not consider his strengths to be vast in magnitude. His strength alone would not be enough to justify being his singular ability, though not so unlike his animal namesake. His strength and his fearlessness is surprising for his size. His adamantium skeleton allows him more leverage to lift and hold heavy objects, and his additional weight adds force to his blows and bolsters his muscle tone. Sabretooth's strength, however, is qualified by the vast distinction. This juxtaposition between the seeming variance of strength or size is for me one of the most appealing motifs in the conflicts between Wolverine and his enemies. Whether it be Sabretooth, the Incredible Hulk, the Juggernaut, Wendigo, or even Batman. The comic book authority and price guide, Wizard Magazine, used to have these last man standing articles in which they would predict the outcome of battles between characters from disparate sources. In 1999 issue 89, they pitted Wolverine against Batman. The writers at Wizard and much of the general comic book community, including myself, have a high regard for the Dark Knight in terms of his tactical and pure fighting ability. In this hypothetical fight, they predicted that Wolverine would do what few can do in hand-to-hand combat and defeat the Dark Knight. This is assuming that Batman did not have enough adequate time to prepare and that the fight is to the death. Admittedly, this may be a mismatch on paper. However, the invincibility of Batman by geekdom has gained meme status. Conversely, it seems to me that a contingency of comic book writers and aficionados have harbored resentment to Wolverine for years. His character is plagued by loss and pain. He is often written into situations that see him on the receiving end of some major damage. While this was an appeal to his character and a great way to display his healing factor, the lethal nature of his adamantium claws could pose a challenge to writers. One swipe of his claws could cut through steel, and his bones were also dense with the substance, which seemingly allows him to survive assaults of various degrees by individuals with vast superhuman strength, like the Juggernaut. However, it may be problematic to write a story in which he faces those without rapid healing, be it the Punisher, or Spider-Man, or Captain America. So these matchups often have him losing to a little more than an adept human martial artist. which would invariably lessen his appeal to some comics devotees. In the Marvel Universe, adamantium is for all intents and purposes indestructible. It is one of the few substances which can pierce the Incredible Hulk's hide. The adamantium, along with Wolverine's potential for berserker fury, make him very dangerous indeed. Wolverine once, in an act of berserker fury, slashed at the face of Ben Grimm, better known as the Thing. The attack would leave him disfigured for a duration of 3 years, during which he donned a metallic helmet to conceal his disfigurement. Wolverine's lethal adamantium claws, indestructible skeleton, and healing factor are undoubtedly the main factors which allow Wolverine to tangle with some powerful foes, of which he is seemingly at a decided disadvantage. An example of this is when Wolverine dares to tangle with Magneto. As a supervillain who can control metallic substances on a molecular level, you'd think Wolverine would be reticent to tangle with him, but you'd be wrong. Time and again, he would attack the Master of Magnetism with lethal force, with varying levels of success. His attacks only dampened by Magneto's body armor, which allowed him to survive on the rare occasion Wolverine would connect, though severely wounded. Wolverine would pay a most bitter price when in Fatal Attractions Wolverine got close enough to land a mortal wound on the Master of Magnetism, preventing him from killing his son, Quicksilver. In a dying act, Magneto would use his abilities to melt the adamantium bonded to Wolverine's skeleton, previously thought to be irreversible. Admittedly, this was somewhat of a traumatic event for me. Its magnitude with respects to comics is the most significant for me, with the death of Superman in a close second, and third with Nightfall's the breaking of the bat. The event would put Wolverine's life in mortal danger, spared only by the combined telekinetic and telepathic abilities of Jean Grey and Professor Xavier, and the otherworldly actions of the dead sister of the mutant Colossus, Illyana. For me, a very alluring aspect of comics, perhaps myth and folklore, is the idea of a hero dying and returning from death. Though up until then, Wolverine has died in various what-if scenarios posited by the Watcher in an alternate timeline or two, it was my understanding that many of the X-Men had died at some point save for Wolverine. Though he was ready to die, the dead sister of Colossus pushed him back into the realm of the living. Wolverine would resist, but he would return willingly to save his unrequited romantic love, Jean Grey, from death on the return to Earth after the assault of Magneto on Asteroid M. This issue is undoubtedly one of my favorite to read and to possess. Its artwork and story typifies what I consider to be great comic book reading. The following era in which Wolverine lost his adamantium sparked a resurgence in my interest to keep up with his comics. He seemingly lost his healing factor, discovered his claws were bone, and left the X-Men after he was no longer able to cut it in the Danger Room. Up until then, it was believed that his claws were a result of the process which bonded the adamantium to his skeleton. For the bone claws to remain meant that he was in fact born with his claws. A revelation. The usage of his claws would indeed pierce his very flesh, made practical only through his healing factor. The pain of the usage of his claws, in all likelihood, contributed to his potential for berserker fury. One may punch a wall when they're angry. The pain may mitigate or increase their fury. Wolverine pops his claws. So in that time when he'd used his claws, they were bloody, and his hands were in bandages as his healing factor was all but non-existent. Wolverine would face enemies without an indestructible skeleton, bone claws, and void of his healing factor. It was in that time that he fought Cyber, a foe literally covered in adamantium save for his head, which Wolverine would slash. Cyber would respond in kind by breaking one set of his bone claws. They would slowly regrow over the course of several issues. He also fought and reconciled with Lady Deathstrike, defeated the Vampire Bloodscream, stood up to the Juggernaut, and lost to the Merc with a mouth, Deadpool. Deadpool would leave Wolverine for dead. He would survive only due to the return of his latent healing factor. It was during the 90s that DC and Marvel had their crossover event. It was then that I had my first introduction to the character that Wolverine would be facing, the DC Comics parody of the anti-hero, Lobo, a psychotic, brutish killing machine with a ridiculous healing factor, which in essence makes him virtually unkillable, as neither heaven nor hell would have him, possessing vast superhuman strength, enough to give even the likes of Superman a hard time. Like Superman, Lobo is the last member of his alien race. Unlike Superman, he is responsible for their genocide, as he destroyed the very planet of his birth. In Action Comics issue number 684, while in pursuit of the monster who would eventually succeed in killing him, Doomsday, Superman would compare his current struggle with the occasions he's had with Lobo. For Superman to be reminded of Lobo when dealing with Doomsday would suggest that Lobo is ridiculously strong. But perhaps Superman made the comparison more in terms of their erratic and irrational nature. Superman would battle and defeat the Incredible Hulk in the crossover, a perennial foe of Wolverine, while Wolverine, void of his indestructible adamantium, would defeat Lobo. Though it would later be revealed that Lobo purposefully threw the fight for money. I, though admittedly biased, am dubious. The beings responsible for the contest deemed victory to be attained not necessarily in death, but the incapacitation of one of the combatants. Lobo, not so unlike the Wendigo, is in essence unkillable, but can be left in an incapacitated state. I'll concede blow for blow, Wolverine is no match for Lobo. Polls predicting this matchup to this day unanimously have Lobo as the clear winner. While the outcomes of the matches were based on polls written by comic book readers, I do believe Wolverine could incapacitate Lobo, similar to what he did to the Wendigo in his first appearance. However, this possibility is much more plausible with adamantium claws and not bone. While many consider the crossover non-canonical, it is nonetheless a documented instance of the two engaging in battle. The crossover would show Wolverine taking a swipe at Thanos of Titan and live to talk about it, unlike when he did it when he wielded the Infinity Gauntlet. And its conclusion would have both Marvel and DC universes merge to form an amalgam of superheroes. Wolverine would merge with all people, Batman, to form Darkclaw. His arch-nemesis would be a character formed by a combination of Sabretooth and the Joker, Hyena. Or is he a combination of the Creeper and Sabretooth? The Amalgam Comics was formed as a result, which I thought was a joke, but regardless of its validity, I was not compelled to read. As for the Wolverine comics, I began to lose interest shortly after that time, as the writers had Wolverine changing to a more feral form. For me, this was the death of Wolverine of sorts. I found the look and indeed some of his actions far too off-putting. It is only in the production of this video that I can fully acknowledge this form as Wolverine and not some other unrelated character. The Age of Apocalypse provided an alternate timeline version of Wolverine, in which he was with Jean Grey and not Cyclops. And all it cost him was the loss of a limb. While Cyclops would lose an eye, I would resume the reading of Wolverine in 1998 with issue number 126 to see Wolverine get demolished by his arch-nemesis, Sabretooth, with the revelation that he now possessed an adamantium skeleton and claws. Sabretooth would assert himself as the superior of the two, insisting that it was indeed the adamantium which gave Wolverine the false impression that they were ever so evenly matched. The animated series on Fox aired its last episode in 1999. And before that time, I had since discovered a new animated art form which would surpass any American-made animated feature at that point, with perhaps the exception of the original Heavy Metal or the Spawn series on HBO. This was a few years before the Justice League and Justice League Unlimited animated series would air. While there were other animated series based on comics that I kept up with, they were largely eclipsed upon the discovery of Dragon Ball Z and various other anime, including the original Fist of the North Star and the anime masterpiece, Akira. It was on the inception of the 21st century that the first X-Men live-action movie was released.
Which enables him to heal rapidly.
For me, it came to a lukewarm, if not indifferent, reception. The role of Wolverine was cast to the then unknown actor for me, Hugh Jackman. It was this casting which was one of the main reasons I largely ignored the early movies. Wolverine stands 5'3", while Jackman is almost a foot taller at 6'2". For me, it seemed as though the casting was a symptom of the general popularization of Wolverine. No longer was he the homely, stocky, wild-haired underground character, but he transformed into a lean, finely coiffed pretty boy, altogether more mainstream. His persona made the love triangle between Cyclops and Jean more interesting, because he and Cyclops were polar opposites. It would suggest that Wolverine represented an appeal to Jean that Cyclops could never embody. And yet, this Jackman at first glance could easily be cast as Cyclops. At the time, Jackman did not possess the physique of my favorite character by a long shot. Traditional action stars of the 80s like Stallone, Schwarzenegger, and Van Damme had some impressive physiques. In the first movies, it was questionable whether Jackman trained at all for the role. In retrospect, my standards were probably too high. It wouldn't be until the release of Wolverine Origins that I began to notice Jackie Boy had been spending time in the gym to portray a more physically accurate depiction of the old knucklehead. When the Wolverine was released in 2013, I had no doubt that Jackie Boy had relinquished his natty card for the role. I was finally compelled enough to watch. Only the finest action stars are willing to take anabolic steroids for a role, which gets extra points in my book. Days of Future Past would be the first movie of the X-Men franchise, which would truly get my attention. The episodes chronicling this from the 90s cartoon are some of the most compelling from the series, and would be nigh impossible for Hollywood to f*** up. Jackie Boy would rise to the occasion, sporting bone claws and a physique which for all intents and purposes damn near perfectly embodied that of Wolverine. Hugh Jackman had succeeded in winning me over. In my mind, he was Wolverine. I now consider his casting as one of the best for a superhero, along with Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool and Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. Logan would mark the ending of Hugh Jackman's portrayal as Wolverine. And with Disney acquiring the rights from Fox to a broader Marvel Comics roster, the only thing for me to lament is what might have been had Jackman's Wolverine been featured in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. However, at the time of the writing of this video, speculation is rampant amidst rumors that a Hulk vs. Wolverine movie may be in consideration, which would feature Mark Ruffalo's Incredible Hulk and Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. If so, it would in all likelihood be the last time Jackman would play the role, as future projects may prove too much for the aging actor to portray. And it appears as though another is set to take on the mantle, and my initial feelings are, I prefer Jackman, but perhaps he can win me over too with time. I have kept up with the Wolverine comic on and off over the years. With the growth of his popularity and the vast scope of pop culture and life in general vying for my attentions, I found it hard to keep up. Between my latent addiction of a certain MMO, the avid attention given to a certain television series, and the emergence of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, comics have taken a decided backseat. And much of the contemporary titles seem to pale to the era which I appreciate the most for comics, in the 80s to the mid-90s. Typified by the Chris Claremont run of the X-Men, with artwork by Jim Lee. As I stated before, I appreciate the artwork more. It bolstered the tone of the writing and the subject matter, which for me had a harder edge, and yet wasn't too over the top. In response to this market for animated features with a harder edge similar to Japanese animation, such features have been produced, inspired by American comic book characters. In 2009, Hulk vs. Wolverine was released. To my knowledge, it is the only animated feature of its kind which depicts Wolverine at his most violent. Aside from a few sporadic storylines, I have not kept up definitively with the Wolverine comics for an extended period. Instead, I tend to binge graphic novels years after their publication. As such, I know he has since had his adamantium restored. A more definitive story of his past and future has been revealed, with his cast of characters expanded with a few spin-offs. Though Wolverine has died in various instances, a definitive death of Wolverine was done in 2014. A not-so-traumatic event. In fact, it went largely unnoticed by me, along with his return. Recent discoveries have revealed to me that he may be in possession of an Infinity Stone. And other comic titles hint at Wolverine gaining cosmic-level status and beyond. Again, this can only be a result of his popularity growing significantly with the rise of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. With the advent of YouTube, various characters have been set in hypothetical matchups from competing publishers. The Incredible Hulk's powers have grown over the years, as the Hulk is often pitted against Superman or Doomsday in online polls. It would appear that comics writers want to make him more formidable for these matchups. It seems to me the same is being done to Wolverine. Apparently his claws glow red hot now. I find myself torn. While I still go comic hunting in the few comic shops that remain, and hunt for familiar issues for my nostalgia, I look forward to projects for the big screen that may accurately embody a depiction of Wolverine that is true to the character. And all this talk has spurred a renewed interest in me to go to my local comic shop and try to catch up with the exploits of the old knucklehead.
Hello once again, dear Internet. I bet you thought you'd never hear from me again, eh? I sincerely hope and pray that you are doing well in these strange times. All 19 of my very patient subscribers. Still better than 8, huh? If this is your first time here, welcome to my channel, and I thank you all for watching some guy talk about Wolverine. Did you know that every time someone likes or subscribes a video, that you make some guy's day? It's true. This video was brought to you in part by the public domain, in association with the Creative Commons, made possible through fair usage. Many of the action figures used in this video were found on various Flickr accounts. There was some pretty neat stuff over there. If you're into that sort of thing, why don't you check them out? Links are in the description. Until then, tune in again next time as some guy talks about Gears of War.
Got one going out!